In our previous video, we looked at why debt might be a problem for an economy, right? It leads to higher interest rates, having to raise taxes at a time that is hurtful for the economy. It may lead to having to print money. So that begs the question of why do we have so high of debt? Where did the debt in Canada come from? And so let's take a look at where our debt has come from. Well, a big chunk of our debt comes from World War II. In fact, World War I didn't officially end in 2010. You're going, what? 2010? World War I didn't officially end until 2010, 92 years after the last gun was shot, because 2010 is when World War I was finally paid off. That's when Germany paid back the last of the reparations, so that's damages for losing the war. World War I has finally been paid off by most countries across the world. So now we're paying for World War II. So we're still paying for costs incurred in World War II. And then on top of that, we see starting in the 1970s, more income support programs. So creations of welfare programs, social insurance, CPP, and EI, and so we're starting to see more in terms of housing to help others, welfare assistance, subsidies, transfer payments. So this increase in income support programs is costly. In addition to that, it started at a period of time when there were high interest rates. So remember, the 1970s is a period of stagflation. Well, we know from the Fisher effect, when you have high inflation, you have high interest rates, right? We have to compensate you for the fact that your money doesn't buy what it bought before. If prices are constantly on the rise, then if you're going to lend money, you're going to have to pay that higher interest rate so that when you get the money back, you can buy what it bought before the prices went up. So the problem is we borrowed a bunch of money for these income support programs during a period of high inflation. So we had high interest rates on those loans. And so we're still paying off those initial income support programs from the 70s. We had high interest rates again in the 1990s. We continue to add to our debt today because of counter-cyclical fiscal policy. So counter-cyclical fiscal policy says we are trying to counter the business cycle, right? So if we look at the business cycle, we have expansion, peak, contraction, and trough. During an expansionary period, the economy is booming. During a contraction, the economy is declining. We have a recessionary gap. And that counter-cyclical fiscal policy is about closing that recessionary gap. Well, how do you close the recessionary gap? You can stimulate the economy with government spending. You can get money in people's pockets so they spend by lowering taxes. Now, the challenge with the counter-cyclical fiscal policy is that if we are focusing on closing the gap, we are going to have a budget deficit, which adds to the debt. Now let's look at the challenge with the 2008 recession and then the 2015 recession. So see if I can go back a couple slides. So bear with me as we slide through. Let's go back to our deficits. Scroll, 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 scroll. Lots and lots of scrolling. That's the US, here's Canada. Okay, so counter-cyclical fiscal policy says during that contractionary phase, government spending goes up, taxes go down, deficit spending. Well, how come the debt keeps getting bigger? Well, what if you don't get to a point where you have a budget surplus, so you can't pay down the debt, and you go from trying to close that recessionary gap to trying to close a different recessionary gap. Well, deficit spending, and it can accumulate and become debt. So there's a challenge with this counter-cyclical fiscal policy that it adds to debt. There's an additional challenge with the counter-cyclical fiscal policy, and that is the impact that the counter-cyclical fiscal policy can have if you already have lots of debt. So if we already have lots of debt, we know from our previous discussion that if you have lots of debt and you want to borrow more money for that next set of deficit spending, you're going to have to make your interest rates go up. Well, if interest rates go up, that's going to impact your economy, because when the interest rates are higher, businesses, it costs them more to borrow, and so they're less likely to do investment spending. So part of the challenge with this counter-cyclical fiscal policy is we're trying to use the government to help stimulate the economy, but if you already have too much debt, it's going to drive up interest rates, and then you're priming the pump. Your stimulus is not going to work as well because any increase in government spending is going to be offset by that decline in business investment spending because it costs them more to borrow, that higher interest rate. And so again, now you have to spend even more to stimulate the economy, and you're just adding to the debt, creating even more problems. In the next video, we'll look at some different theories on fiscal policy. When might you want to change the government spending or tax revenue? And that depends on your goals. Are you trying to balance the budget? Are you trying to close the gaps? Or perhaps you're trying to compromise between the two?